So as Colin mentioned, I'm an economist. I'm with the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy, and in particular with the Ag, Food, and Environment and Food Policy and Applied Nutrition programs there. And I have a lot of fun when I do come here to Medford doing stuff with Ty and working with Colin and some other collaborators on the Tea project he mentioned. But I don't get to talk to undergraduates as part of my teaching at Friedman downtown. We only have graduate and professional students there. So it's a lot of fun for me to get to meet some of the environmental studies students here as well. So one of the things I spend a lot of time about is thinking about consumer interest in food products, and particularly this overlap of different things that I care about in my own research and my own personal interests around nutrition, health, environment, ethical considerations. And I'd like to look at how consumers make decisions in that area. So what I'm going to talk about today, and hopefully not run over, is first I want to talk a little bit about consumer decision making and how we can think about the ethical and environmental aspects of food production as part of what we actually eat and what we consume. In the second part, I'll talk briefly about the results from a few research studies I've been involved in. And then at the end, if there's time and probably leading into discussion, talk more generally about kind of the future of ethical and environmental considerations in the marketplace for food. And I think that'll be a good launching off place for questions and people's comments and viewpoints. And so this talk I called Credence by the Cup, and why we're calling it that should be obvious in a few minutes. I'd like to acknowledge some of my co-authors on some of the research. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge Rebecca Mame, who helped put together some of the materials for this talk. She's a doctoral student that I work with at Friedman. So increasingly, we care not just about how good something we are eating or drinking tastes and whether it's healthy for us or not, but we want to know more and more about how that's produced. And I know that for many people in the room, that's a big part of your own decision making. And we've seen that in the marketplace for food and beverage products in general. So we care not just about what's in the cup, but what happened before it gets to the cup, if we're thinking about a cup of coffee, for example. And how do we think about what's actually in that cup? So to a nutritionist, there's all sorts of macronutrients and micronutrients in that cup of coffee. To a chemist, Colin and I are working with a chemist on some of our key work, those are chemical compounds that might produce different flavor attributes or give us some of the health benefits. To a sensory scientist, you might think about the mouthfeel, or how bitter is that cup of coffee, or how sweet are the things that have been added to the coffee, and different flavors and aromas. And to an economist, that cup of coffee is a bundle of attributes, which includes all the things we just mentioned, the taste, the perceived health benefits, but also other things that we might think that we're doing when we buy that cup of coffee. And so thinking of food and beverage as bundles of attributes, and really, you can think of anything we consume or purchase as a bundle of attributes, and how we make decisions when some of those attributes we really like, and some of the attributes in a product we don't like, or things that we would like to see aren't readily present there, and how we make those decisions is kind of fascinating to me. So let me be a little bit theoretical for a few minutes and talk about the types of attributes, the typology of attributes. So the first type of attribute is the search attribute. If you go looking to buy an apple, there are things you can search for. There can be a sign with the name of the type of apple. The main search attribute that we care about is what, in terms of information for buying something? Usually price. You usually want to know how much this costs, and that's a search attribute. You can easily find out the price. It's either provided to you readily, or it's something you can easily find out. So search attributes are things that are knowable before you purchase an item. Right? And if I want to sell you something, the way I advertise around search attributes is I provide information. You know, I put an ad in the newspaper and say, this is the price. This is the miles per gallon on the new car models we're selling. Right? I can just give you that information. If you're buying a house, one of the major purchases that anybody might make in their life, you look for a lot of information. How good are the schools here? How far am I from work? Right? So these are search attributes. They're knowable beforehand. The next type of attribute is experiential attributes, and these are very different. You can't really find out about experiential attributes very easily before you consume something. And these are more intrinsic to the consumer. How does this taste to you? What is the ambiance of your favorite coffee house? These are more personal, usually more subjective. And once somebody's formed an opinion of their experience of a product, you can't really tell them their experience is wrong. That experience might change over time, that opinion might change over time, but a concerned friend or an advertiser or anyone else might want to influence you, it's hard to tell you, you really don't like the taste of that pizza you're eating right now. You just think you do. How would you advertise experiential attributes? So providing taste tests is a great way to kind of provide information about experiential attributes when we're talking about food and beverages. How else might you advertise experiential attributes? It's tricky. Yeah, so things like that, but you have to bring people near the product in order to do that. So think of fragrances, cologne. So, I mean, you buy that for the fragrance, for the aroma. How do we advertise that? We advertise that with bare body parts, right? It's called associative advertising. So it's hard to advertise other than if you pick up a fashion magazine and there's those smelly samples of colognes in the binding. You know, it's hard to advertise these things, so we advertise things that we want you to associate with it. So fragrances, cologne is often associated with sensuality. So, and if you've paid attention to those ads, it's always like part of a bare shoulder or you know, half of a guy's abdomen, right? It's never, you can never see anybody's face in cologne advertising. Or testimonial advertising. We want you can't try this product easily beforehand, but we want you to associate it with perhaps a famous person whom you relate to somehow. So, oh, if my favorite baseball player likes this product, maybe I will. Or if this movie star likes this product, she's glamorous, and maybe it'll help me be more glamorous. So experiential attributes are harder to advertise beforehand. We can try to provide that experiential opportunity so that people can form those opinions. But we care a lot about these, particularly with food. Taste is a big driver of what we eat or what we're going to go back and eat again and again. And then the third category of attributes we care about are credence attributes. And credence attributes are things that they're very real. These are not make-believe attributes, but these are attributes that an individual consumer cannot determine their absence or presence or the level of their presence even after consuming the product. When you drink that cup of coffee, you can't really drink whether it was organic, shade-grown, taste whether it was organic or shade-grown or fair trade, right? But you care about these things potentially, even though it's not something you can directly ascertain even after consuming the product. You can't taste the pesticide residue on the apple necessarily. In fact, you would need some fairly complex equipment to really test for the any pesticide residue, the presence or absence. But we still care about these things. So there's a problem, perhaps, then, in how we can sell or advertise credence attributes. What's the problem? So, and why might it be mislabeled? Yeah, so this could be this greenwashing that Colin referred to in his introduction, or even more insidious, it could be outright fraud. Because providing credence attributes is usually associated with a higher cost of production. Farmers who use pesticides don't do it because they want to use pesticides, they do it because it increases yields and protects the quality of the crop. And so to not use that often raises the cost of production. If consumers are interested in having things without pesticides on it, they may be also willing to pay a premium for that. So the willingness to pay a premium, the fact that it often costs more to provide, would also then perhaps create an incentive for fraud. So if I tell you this is organic or I didn't use pesticides, it's hard to prove because you're not sure even after you've consumed the good. So we call this, an economist calls this information asymmetry. Right? This is a problem of providing credence attributes to the consumer. And so how do we overcome information asymmetry? This is meant to be a confusing slide. That's on purpose. Well, with labels. And so those of you who care about the credence attributes of food production have become very familiar with some of these labels. I would hesitate to say all of these labels, though, because I'm sure, I'm not sure how many of us could really know all of these labels. The label provides the information, the signal to the consumer. This has those credence attributes that you might care about. And then what's the other part we need to ensure the presence of the credence attributes? The label plus something else. You need to trust the label. So the way we typically do that is with third-party certification. So USDA Organic, that's a label. The food manufacturer puts it on. The government has a set of standards, but then third-party certifiers come in and say, well, we've inspected this facility, we've inspected the producers every so often, and they meet the standards. That third-party certification is necessary to provide the assurance that this is actually produced in the manner in which you hope it is. All right, so, and that's a way of overcoming information asymmetry. If we think of this back in terms of this typology of attributes I introduced, it's a way of taking credence attributes and turning them into search attributes. If you can trust the label and if you know what the label means, then you can search for the label. And some of you have seen that Follow the Frog ad. Have any of you seen that? So Rainforest Action Network, Rainforest Alliance's Follow the Frog campaign actually says all you have to do is follow the frog, right? So it's meant to convert, simplify this process for us. But the problem, perhaps, is that maybe it's not so simple. Look at all these different labels. Because some of these are around environmental attributes, some of these are around producer welfare, farmer welfare. Fair trade would probably be the most well-known example of that. Animal welfare, nutritional aspects, so things like guiding stars or Nuval that are meant to ensure or tell us what's a healthier option or a less healthy option. And then the oldest commercially widespread labeling system would be the kosher certification in the United States. It's the exact same model that we think of with fair trade and other things. Third-party certifiers, multiple certifiers competing with each other, kind of like in fair trade, and that it's a way of having a label that tells you that this has been produced in the manner in which you might be interested, right? So kosher certification is really kind of the forerunner of all this label proliferation we see. So it's pretty easy to go from label proliferation to label confusion. So, and this is about 4 years old now. It was a nice summary in the Washington Post showing you the number of labels in the US and worldwide in these different areas of production, ensuring credence attributes, the presence of credence attributes, all sorts of things around paper production, furniture production, energy certification of buildings, electronics. Some of these you've seen, some of them you might not have seen. And this is 4 years old. I would say that the number of available labels has probably doubled in the marketplace in just that time, because so many store chains, retail chains have introduced their own labels. Whole Foods has multiple labels that they've introduced in the last few years. There's been a lot of new efforts around seafood labeling in particular, and it's really hard to keep track of all these. I mean, part of my job is to do work on keeping track of some of this, and I have a hard time. So even for very motivated consumers, to really know what all these labels mean might be very difficult. And we might call this, this idea of using these labels to guide our purchases political consumerism. And the idea of political consumerism is that our choices in the marketplace, you know, don't just impact our own well-being or our own preferences. You know, I might buy an organic product because I don't want to expose myself to pesticide residues, so purchasing the organic product I might see as a way of reducing that personal risk, but also more so that it's a way of showing my will in the marketplace and trying to somehow purchase the type of world in a little bit at a time that I want to see, right? So voting with the shopping cart as opposed to voting through the voting booth. So that's not different idea than just buying the products I'd rather consume, but it talks about extrinsic motivations. I'm doing this because I want things to happen elsewhere. I'm buying this not just because I want that product for myself, but I want coffee growers to have better livelihoods. And so each purchase opportunity is a vote that one is perhaps making. So in this attribute-based view of consumer decision-making, we might think about what is motivating consumers. And there's a lot of work, both theoretical and empirical, that researchers have done on this. Some of you might be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And in this framework, so the most basic, the bottom of the pyramid are the most basic needs that you need to meet. So breathing, food, water, sex for reproduction and survival of the species, sleep, homeostasis, excretion. Without these needs being met, individuals or species fail to survive, right? So those are pretty key. And you probably don't worry too much about the label on your coffee if you're not breathing, all right? So, I mean, that's not a value judgment. I'm just saying, you know, it's okay, breathe. And then safety is the next one. Security of our body, our employment. So kind of, all right, in the short term I'm surviving. Do I think I'm going to survive in the mid to long term? So the safety is around that. Security of your family, of your property. And then we start coming to slightly more abstract needs that then once these lower level needs are met, we can worry about meeting needs of love and belonging, family, friendship, intimacy. Higher up the ladder, esteem, self-esteem, confidence, achievement. You want the respect of others and to be respected by others. And then at the upper level of the pyramid, this idea of self-actualization, that you are determining the type of being, the type of person you are, your morality, creativity, spontaneity, problem solving, acceptance of facts, tolerance, these types of things, self-actualization. So working on what type of person do you want to be. And this political consumerism, we think of individual motivations, ties into these higher levels of the pyramid. Okay, I need food to survive, but does purchasing certain products give me self-esteem? Does purchasing certain products give me the opportunity to pursue self-actualization? So this is, you know, really aiming at this upper level of the pyramid in terms of what might motivate individual consumers for this. Okay, so this is some of that motivation. And then there's been a lot of, and I won't spend a lot of time with this, but you might have heard discussion of food-related lifestyles. And that really, that a way that consumers might be defining themselves, and certainly that marketers might be defining consumers, is around food-related lifestyle. Okay, and the simple fact that you're in the room right now and that some of you are environmental studies students, I see some of the Friedman master's students here, you're likely to fall into certain food-related lifestyles groups. Some of you have heard the phrase LOHAS, right? So that refers to consumers who are looking for healthy lifestyles, right? So, and who are purchasing products, food products and other products around active, so lifestyle of healthy and active, lifestyle of healthy, active, and something. So sustainability, so yeah, a lot of LOHAs in the circles in which I run, right? So marketers think of segments in this way because they want to know how might they direct advertising, how might they direct product development, and often we identify ourselves, even if not explicitly so, with, oh, if I shop at certain types of places and eat certain types of things, then I feel good about myself. And I like the people who I see doing these things as well. So I don't think it's too cynical to think of that as a food-related lifestyle. And then, you know, we could spend more time on these models. And a lot of work on trying to really parse out the motivations of ethical and sustainable consumers and different models of that. And one important distinction that I'll make here is just between intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. What is it that you want for yourself versus what is it that you want for others around you and the world around you? And that'll be a key distinction in one of the two studies I want to talk about now. Any quick questions about what I just covered, or should we hold that to the end? Okay. So really quickly, I want to talk about two studies that was involved in that kind of bring some of these ideas together and also shows you the kind of fun you can have as a researcher working in these areas. So the first is around some consumer interest in fair trade coffee and some field experiments we did. And a little bit of the motivation for this, I mean, I have this broader interest But I also had some colleagues at another university I worked at. We had a strong coffee clutch tradition. So 10 a.m. every morning we went for coffee, and we'd sit around and enjoy our coffee. But we were also economists, so we'd kind of geek out on, you know. And one day we noticed that the local coffee, almost everything in this food court was selling coffee, but the specialty coffee roaster, where we buy our coffee usually, was selling a fair trade coffee blend at the same prices as conventional coffees. And we said, well, why isn't everyone buying the fair trade then if people prefer it? Well, people must not prefer it. Do they not believe the fair trade label? And then one of my colleagues suggested, well, maybe they are interested in fair trade, but the fair trade coffee doesn't taste very good. He didn't say it nearly as politely. He used words suggesting that it tasted like something that meets the bottom level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so we figured, well, that's an empirical question. Does this not taste as good? And so, you know, not right away, but shortly thereafter, went and worked with a colleague, a sensory scientist colleague, to look at this question of does it not taste as good and what determines some of the things about how we think it tastes. And then we also did some studies on willingness to pay. And just really quickly review this, I think people are fairly familiar with some of the issues with coffee, but coffee market's fairly volatile. But there's an investment in growing the plants because the plants take up to 5 years to mature. So there's this disconnect between how much adjustment in the short term that producers can do to adjust to changing market conditions because of the nature of the plants and how volatile coffee prices can be. And you really need either hot, sunny, lower altitudes, and that's primarily associated with these lower grades of coffee, the Robusta beans, stuff that ends up in the big cans of Maxwell House or chock full of nuts and it's served at your local diner, and or the Arabica beans, which are grown primarily in shady, temperate, higher altitude areas, often on steep slopes. And this is your higher grades of coffee, your specialty coffees, what you buy at Starbucks or at a higher end vendor. Those extreme weather events often affect the yields. So supplies can be down from year to year and the prices go up a lot. What happens when prices go up, so there's a world market. So if there are poor production conditions in one part of the world, and you live in a part of the world where the conditions have been fine and you see prices are high, then that entices new growers in to the marketplace in those areas. But then new growers come online, supply goes up, and then those high prices don't stay. So there's really very volatile ride for prices. And on top of that, there's often there's a lot of concerns about market concentration. Not with the producers. There's lots of producers. They're primarily smallhold producers. And not so much even on the retail end. I mean, think of all the competition in around Boston for where you can buy a cup of coffee. It's different parts along the supply chain and around the supply, the wholesalers who are purchasing this from producing countries and getting it to wealthier countries that have larger amounts of consumption. And so the basic way that fair trade works, and we could spend a lot of time just going into the details, but it provides a price floor, a guaranteed price floor. So if you are participating in the fair trade coffee, you get a minimum price, and that price has changed and gone up a little bit over the years, but that minimum price is guaranteed. So when prices are down, that's paid. And when prices are high, then instead you're guaranteed a premium. And in order to participate in the program, producers have to agree to certain things, some of which include around the structure of production, that the farmers have to be organized into cooperatives, that they can't have more than they can't have large numbers of full-time employees, that it's really meant to be smallholders organized into cooperatives, and then some things around the production of the coffee itself. And so you can see, and here's also just shows you just, you know, the light blue line is the fair trade price. The darker blue line is the world market price on Arabica beans, and you can see it's sometimes very low, it jumps around a lot, and then when it jumps above that floor price, then the premium comes into play, right? And there's a lot of wrinkles to this, and there's actually multiple certifiers who don't always get along, have had some disagreements about the importance of certain requirements, and there's been some interesting feuds around that. But this is the basic way that this works. So because they're being paid a premium, it comes down to usually paying a premium for your cup of coffee. So we want to look at this with brewed cups of coffee. So the first thing we did were these taste tests to look at this idea, well, is the coffee not as good? And there's actually some reasons why fair trade coffee might not always be of high quality, because some of it takes a certain amount of entrepreneurial ability to participate in fair trade. And those producers might also have access to higher end markets. So sometimes fair trade producers drop out of fair trade because they find they're making more by selling to a fancier market, a fancier part of the market, by and selling their better beans there. So perhaps if you're a fair trade producer, you sell your best beans outside of fair trade because they'll get a high price, and you might have an incentive to not always sell your best beans as fair trade. So, and there's some argument about whether or not that takes place, but does that show up in the taste of coffee? So we did paired blind taste tests, and this is kind of like what you see in a TV commercial where, well, which did you like best? Here, oh my favorite brand is not the one I chose. I feel so silly. So it was that format, but we weren't trying to make anyone feel silly or sell coffee. So first we'd give them identity blinded, just 2 cups of coffee, taste it, tell us what you think of it, kind of on a 1 to 9 scale, from 1 is really don't like it to 9 is really like it. And these consumers haven't been trained. There was a fast intercept study. We come up to somebody at a supermarket or at the university or at a farmer's market and ask them if they would taste some coffee. And it's interesting to think about, if you want people to taste coffee and tell you if they like it, how you need to set that up. You need to allow them to drink it the way they want to drink it, right? So we had to have milk out and sugar out and anything that people might add to their coffee, because you can't ask people who drink their coffee with cream and 10 sugars to drink a cup of black coffee and say, what do you think of it? They're going to say, I don't think very much of it, and you're not going to really be able to tell much. So then we'd have them do that blind test, and then we'd give them a little bit of information about fair trade in case they weren't familiar with it. Many of our participants were. And then we do the same thing with the same 2 coffees. But this time we just tell them one's fair trade and one's conventional, so that they would know which was fair trade and conventional. And what we did here, we were working with different manufacturers' coffees, but we did all medium roasts, and we kind of paired. So we'd have a Starbucks medium roast conventional, Starbucks medium roast fair trade, and we did that with different manufacturers. So we had an institutional provider of coffee, one of these companies that delivers coffee to offices for use in an office coffee machine. And we had a supermarket brand, a common supermarket brand. And then we just had people rate this, okay? And we got some information on their demographics, et cetera. And the short version of this, and I'll go through this a little bit slower when I talk about wheat bread in a second, because it's a similar pattern, is that when they didn't know which was which, they liked the fair trade and conventional about the same. So across 3 different brands, we found no evidence supporting this hypothesis that the fair trade coffee didn't taste as good, okay? Because they didn't know which was which, and on average, they liked both about the same. And after we provided the information on fair trade and told them which was which, and we didn't tell them that they were drinking the same 2 samples again. They might have guessed that, they might not have. When we provide the labeled information, the average rating for the fair trade coffee went up quite a bit. A fairly large difference, very statistically significant difference. So they preferred the labeled coffee over the conventional coffee, and they preferred the labeled coffee. They thought they liked it better than they had just 5 minutes ago. So it's not likely that their life experience has changed a lot in those 5 minutes. This is within participants. Well, this is, but this is the average across all the participants. But yes, that shifting's happening within participants. And what we did on a similar study is we looked at who are the people who are shifting the most and why. And then, but they didn't rate the conventional coffee any less. That's not a statistically significant difference. So when you tell them it's fair trade, they seem to like it more. And this interaction, you can think of it as a glow effect, a warm glow, that if I think something's good, then I like it better in other ways that aren't directly related. So even though beforehand they thought they tasted about the same, afterwards, I don't interpret this as silly consumers are fooling themselves. I interpret it as that their liking of the coffee is really partially impacted by the whole experience. And if they feel better about the product, their experience goes up and they're going to report a slightly higher liking. So, you know, this isn't a story about, you know, oh, we can trick people into saying they like or dislike things. It really is so their overall impression of the experience, of the sensory experience, goes up when they think that the coffee is also been produced more in line with how they like to see things done. Yes.
And even though most people are very, exact how to make their coffee.
We can control for that directly, but they get to do their own, you know, and there's 202 participants, so the idea is that they did something differently, that any changes are random. It shouldn't be correlated with the one thing we did manipulate, which is how we've labeled the cups. Because they say, yeah, that fair trade coffee is going to need more cream. I don't know, no. Oh, sure. Yep. Yes.
My question is, I'm not sure if you're going into this, but whether this was true over, like, did it vary by location where you're asking people? If you're asking people at a farmer's market, did they like the fair trade more than at a regular supermarket? That sort of like.
I don't recall what we looked for here. In the next, I'll show you some very similar results in a second where we did look at that, and we didn't see big differences there. We did see that it was correlated with certain types of consumers. So yes, as you can imagine, that certain types of consumers or certain locations, they might be more likely to have an increased liking for something based on the labeling. Absolutely. Quickly, I want to just mention an economic study we did on this as well, willingness to pay. And this was a fun field experiment. By field experiment, I mean we were conducting an experiment and the participants didn't know they were in an experiment. So that's kind of the highest level of a field experiment because there's no opportunity for what we call observer effects or limited opportunity for observer effects. If you really don't know you're in an experiment, then what we observe you doing should be what you actually meant to do, and that you're not you know, trying to misrepresent yourself because you know somebody's collecting data and writing this down. So the field experiment here was to work with that specialty coffee vendor at the university and go in and manipulate the prices on the conventional and fair trade coffee. Now, there's obviously some strengths to working the field. There are also some limitations, one of which is that no coffee retailer is going to let you raise their prices because you're going to annoy their customers and their customers won't come back. You know, why was the coffee twice as expensive? So we could only lower the price, but we did it at different amounts and different days. And we'd give the discounts. Yes, people have made fun of that our signs weren't wonderful, but they were effective. And then we recorded all the sales on the conventional and fair trade and other types of coffee each day. And we did this over a period of weeks where we discounted different coffees on different days, and the amount of the discount changed. And then on the days we were doing this, what was nice about the setup is that you had to go around the corner to put a lid on or to put in milk or sugar. And so we could go around the corner and intercept some of the consumers, not all of them, but some of them, and chat with them about their purchase and get a little more data without being in front of the store and ruining, you know, and making it too obvious that we were conducting an experiment. So we gave on a cup of coffee, and the average price for a cup of coffee at this vendor at the time was $1.50. We were giving 10-cent, 25, 30, and 50-cent discounts. And then we also had control days with no price changes so that we could record what was happening when we didn't have these discounts going in there. And then, as I mentioned, we intercepted some of the coffee consumers and could write down their purchases and a little bit about them. So we had a few demographic variables to help explain differences in the purchasing behavior. So we asked them, we wanted to make it very fast, so we just had what we could fit on an index card, some basic questions about were they familiar with fair trade coffee, recorded their gender, whether they were a student, faculty member, a guest, or how they might be affiliated with the university where the food court was, and how much coffee they drank. And, and then, we looked at the data in different ways, but I'll just skip ahead to this. we wanted to know really how are people responding to the price. And a lot of the studies that had been, all the published studies up to the point that we did this study, had just gone by asking people how much more would you pay for a cup of coffee, or setting up very non-realistic experiments, stated choice experiments to get it. And people said, well, I'm interested in this and I'd be willing to pay more. And that's important. It's interesting to know what people say they're willing to pay. But when push comes to shove, what you say you might do is not always the same as what you would do. Because perhaps you might think something sounds great and you say, I pay $3 extra a pound for that coffee. But then when you actually have to do it, you remember that the rent is due at the end of the month, or that you wanted to go to a concert that weekend, and maybe you're a little less interested in spending that money. So this is what we call revealed preference. People didn't know they were in an experiment, and we saw what they actually bought. And what we found here, these are elasticities. And elasticity is a way of expressing a price response, or other responses, but with regards to price, how much more of something do you buy if the price goes down 1%? So it's a percentage increase in price for a percentage, in purchasing for a percentage decrease in price. Or if the price goes up, how much less do you buy of something? Because usually when price goes up, we buy less. When price goes down, we buy more. And so what we found here, if you look at this is what we call the own price elasticity for Colombian coffee. So it's the price of coffee, the conventional Colombian coffee went up. People dropped their purchases, and they were fairly price responsive. If the price went up by 1%, they reduced their purchase by more than 1%. Now, we didn't actually raise the price of coffee, but this is the relative price. It's from when we discounted the fair trade coffee. When the price of fair trade coffee went up, people purchased less of the fair trade coffee when the conventional coffee had the discounts. But it was a pretty muted response. If the price went up by 1%, they only reduced their purchasing by less than 0.5%. And then we could also see how the price of one changed, the purchases of one changed as the other one had the discount. The takeaway on this is that people were less price responsive for the fair trade coffee. The people who were buying the fair trade coffee were going to keep buying it more or less, even as I discounted the conventional coffees. The discount on the conventional coffee, the opportunity to save 25 cents on the cup, didn't persuade the fair trade purchasers to go and switch to the conventional cup very often. But the reverse was very different response. If I discounted the fair trade, relatively more of the conventional coffee drinkers would buy the fair trade coffee that day. They were less loyal to the brand of non-fair trade. And this actually suggests that that consumers are treating fair trade coffee. If you're looking for fair trade, you really think of it as a different product. It's not just a type of coffee. You're not thinking of it like another brand, but rather that it's something different. And so even if the price of something else goes down, it's not a very good substitute. Because if you thought these were very close substitutes, you'd be more price responsive. The people who were buying the conventional coffee usually did see the fair trade coffee as a substitute. So this asymmetric response, suggesting a loyalty to the fair trade coffee and suggesting that what we've seen in other studies when people say, I would pay more for fair trade coffee, it was being supported through this measure as well. And if any of you have ever thought about coupon discounts in stores, this kind of mirrors a fairly well-known effect with coupon discounts, that it's easy to get people to change their brand, or at least for short term. So if I offer $2 off a pound of coffee in the supermarket, you'll buy that brand even if it's not your normal brand. And a lot of us go in and just look, what's on sale this week, right? But you can jack the price of coffee way up and coffee drinkers will still drink it. So we're very price responsive when it comes to switching between brands. But how much of a price shock does it take to get people to stop drinking coffee and start drinking something else instead? It takes a huge price change. Price of coffee is much higher now than it was at times in the recent past. And I doubt too many people change their coffee drinking behavior in this room very much based on that price. So for some people you will. There is some price response, but it's fairly muted. So it seems here again that people are treating fair trade coffee like a different product rather than a different brand of coffee. So really fast, because we're running out of time, I'll mention some studies we did with some organic wheat bread, and these were fun because what we did here, we had some taste tests involved. We did a willingness to pay survey, in this case, a hypothetical, a stated choice thing. But what was really neat is that we had conventional and organic wheat grown under identical conditions except for the differences that are required by organic production. So these were matching plots a kilometer away from each other, similar soil types, similar, obviously similar weather conditions that they're facing the whole time. The wheat was harvested in the same way, stored in the same way, the breads were baked in identical manners, stored after baking in the same way, prepared in the same way, et cetera. So we had really, the difference was just conventional versus organic wheat that was going into the bread. So, you know, there's none of this buying organic bread off of a shelf and asking people, did you like this better than the Freihoffer's Wonder Bread? Or, you know, so, and here again, we went to different places. We worked on campus. This was in Western Canada. We worked at shopping centers, at specialty markets, at farmers markets, and we had a tasting experience for people, and then we did this survey. And what types of things did we find when we looked at the sensory experience? We found a similar pattern to before, that, that there was, in this case, a preference for the organic bread. And here we had a little more time with consumers, so we asked their overall liking, but we asked what it was they liked. And this overall liking for the organic bread, and this is in the blind condition, so they don't know it's organic. They like the texture of the organic bread better. So that was a strong finding here. And organic was liked more than conventional. And after we provided the information, which was organic, which was conventional, that difference persisted, and in fact, the gap between the two grew. So that part's similar to what we found with the coffee and the fair trade. The liking of the organic bread increased after we provided information and the label as to which was organic, and there was no significant difference in the conventional. So again, so in this case, people like the organic better in the blind or the naive condition, and that liking, just like in the coffee, increased for the product with the higher level of credence attributes. And again, for organic, that's not true for everybody. And I'll tell you right now, we were conducting these surveys in Alberta, big wheat production areas in some parts of Alberta, and there are lots of people who are very skeptical about organic production. So for some people, the absence of organic label might actually be a positive attribute. So no significant change in liking for conventional after the information. Then we used this, and we did some willingness to pay estimates. I won't provide these here in the interest of time, but then we used these taste differences to explain the differences in willingness to pay. And what we found was that there was a significant effect when we presented other information, because one of the things we did was for some of the participants, they got health information about why the organic production might be something they prefer for their own health. And for others, they got information on the environmental aspects of organic production. And comparing across those two, when you gave them the environmental information, those people were more likely to increase their liking of the product. And when you gave them the health information compared to the environmental information, they were more likely to decrease their liking of the product, and they had lower willingness to pay that they stated when we did the economic part of it, which is, I see pretty clearly as evidence of an expectation that healthy things don't taste as good. So I'll buy organic because it's good for the planet, and I like it, but if I'm buying it because it's good for me, then I don't like it as much. And again, this is randomized across respondents, so anyone, the respondents aren't identical, we're not controlling for it, but we've randomized across several hundred participants. So the fact that this was a strong effect really is interesting to me. Tell somebody it's healthy, they seem to like it less. And so in the absence of the sensory information, the environmental benefits of organic farming were more important than the health benefits for our sample. The other neat thing about this, and it's hard to explain the full methodology, but half the participants, we gave them the information during the blind part and half in the revealed part. So we had for some people were telling us what they were willing to pay for the product before they had tasted it. And so if you tasted it, if you're told it was healthy and then you tasted it, you had higher willingness to pay than the people who hadn't tasted it. So we expect things that are healthy to be less tasty, but that can be overcome by giving people stuff to taste. Okay, so yes, so I needed a lot of equations to tell you what your common sense probably tells you, that you can get people used to healthier things, but they need to overcome perhaps some inertia. So are consumers interested in ethical foods? Yes, they are. Our studies show that there's a real interest, and we are trying to get more general populations and not just specialty market populations, people who've already sorted themselves into this. And there's a large and growing market for these goods, and that's obviously something we've seen, and that's important economically to producers, and it's very important for anybody who's interested in political consumerism as an avenue. Then you want more opportunities for this voting. But then you have to ask yourself, is this consumer power at its best? Is this empowered shoppers exercising their will in the marketplace in a way to change production methods? Or is it simply a tool for price discrimination? Is it a way of separating the price-insensitive consumers, those who are willing to pay more or less, or who are less concerned about price compared to other attributes, from their money? And then, because price discrimination, I mean, we could chat for a long time about price discrimination. It's the reason that books come out in hardcover before they come out in softcover. Because if you really want the new book from your favorite novelist, you'll pay $30 for hardcover before you'll, and there's all sorts, or when we buy our airplane tickets, right? All these things are tools for price discrimination. So is this simply another tool for price discrimination? And then, of course, there are the criticisms of various organic, ethical, environmental labeling schemes and marketing schemes. For example, does fair trade fail to address overproduction concerns that are part of the reason for price volatility and low prices on products like coffee? In fact, could fair trade actually even encourage overproduction in some areas? So that's been a criticism that's been leveled at fair trade. For organics, there's concerns about extensification of land use. So if we stop using chemical inputs that allow us to get more yield per unit of land, then do we need to convert more land? And so we have the negative environmental impacts of converting land to production, even as we have fewer externalities from the land already in production. And where is organic food being produced? Is it increased shipping costs? Local food has been criticized because it might there might be less opportunity for economies of scale in production, and the true energy costs might not be less depending on how these things are being purchased. So everything that we've come up with in the marketplace to try to address problems has then been criticized as well. Maybe it causes new problems. And I think there's something to some of these criticisms, but I also am optimistic because I think the way that we have progress in these areas is by addressing those criticisms where we can, right? So kind of a dialectic approach to, you don't necessarily, there can be something wrong with something and still it can help us get to a better place. And then in general, the need for bright lines may conflict with the goals. And this is an important point that I want to explain very quickly, which is that in order to get something on a label, the label is either there or it isn't. And there's a handful of labeling schemes that have gradation, but for the most part, the label's there or it isn't. So in order to get organic label, you need to meet all these standards, jump all these hoops. But are you well above the standards, or have you just towed the line, right? So I have seen things at organic producers that really are not in the spirit of what you'd want for organic. And I have seen wonderful things that very much in the spirit of being environmentally and sustainably minded from producers who don't have organic certification, right? So these need for bright lines, either you have the label or not, means that we sometimes cause conflict with the goals, all right? Aerial spraying buffer zone requirements for field crops in California as to what's organic or not. Well, they're based on average wind speeds and the like, and when you see how close some of the organic plots are to some of the conventional plots, there's a real worry. Is some spray getting over there on certain days? I'm quite sure it is, right? But it meets the standard of minimum distance and spray requirements, but that standard doesn't necessarily mean that spray never touches the organic crops, right? So that's an example of a bright line that may not be giving us what we think we're buying sometimes when we purchase an organic product. So then this is the larger question: do we work through the shopping cart or through the ballot box to address things that we think need to be improved in the food system? The total green impact of markets might be small if they're relegated to specialty markets. What relegates it to specialty markets? Well, if it's really confusing, if the scale of production limits the reach. So when in the 1990s, when USDA came up with the National Organic Standards, National Organics Program, a big concern among some people who had been buying organic up to that time was that now by having these standardized things, it made it much easier for larger players to come into the organic space. And so if you valued organic in part because it meant small is beautiful, you lost that in the 90s. But if you want the environmental attributes of organic production, you should have been happy that all of a sudden Dole was producing organic in large ways and that large retailers were selling organic. So that scale issue was left out, and now there's other standards for dealing with what is small production and small scale production. But obviously, if small scale production is the goal, then the ability of any one approach to reach a lot of consumers becomes limited. So either this is the adoption of, using organics as an example, this is the adoption of organics that you can now go into Walmart or Target and buy a house brand of organics, or is it the co-option of organics, right? And it's been argued from both sides. And a lot of goals, of course, still need policy. That this, because of the information asymmetry, there's a lot of things we care about, there's a lot of things we need to achieve that can't just be regulated by what the consumer decides to do or what information is available to the consumer. If you think of concerns about toxins in food, I mean, you know, is there a labeling and certification scheme that you would rely on instead of having the FDA, instead of having safety imports? Would you be too happy with a label and let's get rid of all those safeguards? Probably not. And we'd really worry about fraud in that area if we left it all to the marketplace, right? So we can have food safety assurances provided in the marketplace, but we probably don't want to rely just on the marketplace to provide food safety assurances. So Michael Pollan's famous quote, we have to vote with our votes as well as our food dollars. Perhaps that's a good point to end on and see what you all think about how we provide credence attributes and what motivates consumers to seek them out. Okay. Some questions or comments? Yes.
When it comes to, labeling that's sort of misleading, like, it'll say cage-free or they just put their chicken in grease, is there a way for more truly, humane products to set themselves apart when there's this sort of, these politics of confusion and sort of misleading?
So the question was about labels being confusing or deliberately misleading, and is there some way to get around that? I mean, the way to get around some of that is to have regulatory definitions about what something is. So then you'd have a regulatory definition. You can't use this phrase on the label unless cage-free has to mean this, this, and that. But then we open up the same issues that we had with the organics. The organic standards took years and years to get in place, and a lot of people were unhappy with them precisely because if you're going, you need these bright lines. So regulatory backing or definition is one approach, but that's not always satisfactory. Or using trademark things. So then do we have a label that has to be recognized? So I think most people recognize the USDA organic label, and if instead it said Sean's Organic and a picture of my face and my thumb up, you might say, what is that? So we either need trusted brands of labels or regulatory definitions in more areas. And so an area where that's been hotly debated right now is around, should there be a definition for natural? So the phrase natural means everything and nothing. A lot of people are concerned it's being misused on a lot of packages. All natural, well, what does that really mean? And so there's a push to define all natural in a broader set of contexts. It's tough to say. I mean, the government, is the ability to be an authoritative voice, and it gives you both the opportunity for individuals and groups to sue if something's going wrong, and for government regulatory action, you know, administrative enforcement to take place. So you end up with more tools to make sure you're getting what you want, but government's slow and clunky, and the way things have to be written in the statute are even more constraining than what you would get in promulgating a standard in the marketplace. So do you want an answer now, or do you want do you want a more definitive answer in 8 years? Right, that's often the trade-off you get if you're thinking about government versus marketplace. Well, once it's in place, I think it's definitive because it is becomes laid out in statute and regulation, and not, you know. But so you talk about the lobbying. There was a big thing over whether GMO products containing GMO ingredients could be USDA organic, right? And a lot of lobbying on whether organic was going to mean GMO free or not. And so yes, there will be those debates, and they'll be influenced the same way any political debate is. Yes. So the question was about what's the future of labels, and will labels cease to exist or if they're not trusted. There's a lot of movement right now about using apps that rather than, and it's a way of getting across this up or down aspect of the label. Hey, does it have the label or not? So if instead I can scan something on a barcode and find out a lot of detailed information about the production, then that might be a way to move past, because it's much more fine information. But then the downside of all this, and the issue around label confusion, is the processing costs. Even highly motivated consumers only have so many hours that they're willing to stand in the supermarket with the ice cream melting before they make their decision. And for many people, other constraints, you know, as an economist, I always think about constraints. We have financial constraints on what we can buy, but the time constraint is even bigger. You have 168 hours in a week. Whatever you do with those 168 hours, you're not getting any more, right? So highly motivated consumers, apps seem to be a good way forward, but at the same time, think of how much of energy and effort it takes to scan 100 products. And another thing to keep in mind with labels and even, you know, nutrition facts panels, or if you're scanning something, product formulations can change fairly frequently, more frequently than you might expect. So you have in your mind, here are products I like, and you don't realize that the sodium content changed since 6 months ago, the last time you read the label. So, you know, do we need to be scanning things every time we go into the store? So technology has a lot of promise, but again, it's only going to be some consumers who will use it all the time.
We have time for one last short question.
Okay. Yeah, so the question was about the price experiments with the coffee. That was at a university coffee shop. So no, we had to buy a sample. We recorded the affiliation with the university. So obviously we're getting more students. We were getting, you know, and we were getting people who were different than other people in parts of town. And that's more methodologically, when you're doing field experiments and you're doing something in situ, what you get is a very representative sample of the population of people who would be at that store. But then it's a generalizability that you have to worry about. So I feel good about what we did in that setting, but is that the same thing we get at a coffee shop across the street from a large casino? No, I think there's different people hanging out at the casino than at the university at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Absolutely.
Well, let's thank Sean once again.
Thank you. Yeah, I can hang around for a few minutes.